I'm here with Minister of Justice Kaycee Madu to make an historic decision, an historic announcement about one of the most important and fundamental democratic reforms in the history of our province, the introduction of a citizens' initiative law. This day has been a long time coming for me personally, because way back in the early 1990s, when I was representing the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, I helped to draft a model citizens initiative law and lobbied members of the then Alberta legislature and the Klein government to introduce it. Different versions of it were brought forward as private members' bills, but they were consistently voted down. While British Columbia actually did introduce its own citizens initiative law in 1993, it became effective in 1995, and it was successfully used in 2010 to challenge the harmonization of the GST in that province. Citizens Initiative is a legal process which allows voters, if a certain number of them sign a formal legal petition, to force a referendum vote on a matter of public importance. It is all and simply about empowering ordinary people to raise and force the consideration of big issues if those of us in elected positions are not listening to them. It is a powerful democratic tool, a tool that has been used for well over a century in representative democracies around the world, in most American states, in many European countries, earlier during the progressive era in the 1910s and 20s here in Canada, and as I say, more recently in British Columbia. You know, I believe in the representative nature of our parliamentary democracy, but I also know that sometimes politicians of different parties at different times and different places fail to listen to the fundamental wishes of the people. And this initiative law is a guarantee that people can overcome when politicians are not listening to the people. I'll give you one example. The last NDP government violated an election commitment not to introduce a carbon tax. It was a huge hidden agenda. It was massively and consistently rejected by Albertans. Sure, a lot of elites liked the carbon tax, but ordinary Albertans hated it, and they didn't have a chance to vote on it. Thankfully, in Alberta, since 1995, we have had the Taxpayer Protection Act, something I also worked on back in the day at the Taxpayers Federation, and we, as a government, will keep our election commitment to amend the Taxpayer Protection Act so that we can never have a sales tax brought into Alberta without voters permitting or a carbon tax in the future. But today, Minister Madu, on behalf of our government, is keeping a commitment to introduce the Citizens Initiative Act, which more broadly allows voters to force a province-wide referendum on issues that matter the most to them if the legislature and the government is not listening. After the re-election of Justin Trudeau's Liberal government in the fall of 2019, I gave an address to Albertans and talked about the need for us to use every tool at our disposal to fight for a fair deal for Alberta, to fight against the discriminatory Ottawa policies that have hammered our economy and our way of life. And one of the commitments I made at that time in November of 2019, after our last provincial election, was to give Albertans this empowering democratic accountability tool of Citizens Initiative. I said that we would refer it to an all-party committee of Alberta's legislature to consult broadly with Albertans on the right details to make a Citizens Initiative bill workable. And that I want to thank the Special Select Committee of Alberta's legislature, chaired by Cardston Siksika MLA Joseph Scow, and the members of that committee who've met for several months to review citizens' initiative laws around the world, the history of these laws in Canada, to listen to grassroots Albertans and academic experts as well on how best to design the initiative bill. They made their recommendations to Alberta's government last December. Minister Madu and his team have spent the subsequent few weeks taking on board that advice, framing a bill that's gone through the process of caucus consultation consultations and was ratified by Alberta's cabinet in the last couple of weeks. It was tabled, I believe, Kaycee, by you just moments ago in the Legislative Assembly. This bill will allow 10% of Alberta voters to force a referendum on either a policy proposal or a legislative proposal. And let me be clear, in British Columbia, their initiative law has much higher and more stringent thresholds. They require that you have to hit 10% of signatures amongst voters in every one of their 85 plus constituencies. That's not the case here. Albertans will, if 10% of Alberta voters sign a legally filed initiative petition, they will be able to force a referendum vote on a matter that matters to them. If, however, people are proposing a constitutional amendment, which is obviously a higher threshold, and which can touch on the conflict of rights, for example, that requires a higher threshold, a 20% signature threshold with a requirement that they hit 20% in 2/3 of the electoral districts in Alberta to ensure that regions as well are protected. I think this is a balanced approach, but as I say, this is one of the most important democratic reforms since our provinces was founded in September of 1905. I'm proud to have finally, after 30 years of work, have achieved this goal. I cannot wait for the debate in the legislature, the passage of this legislation, and for it to come into effect later this year. Another promise made and another promise kept for a stronger and more democratic Alberta. With that, I'll invite Minister of Justice and Solicitor General Kaycee Madu to offer some more details.
Thank you, Premier. As Premier said a moment ago, I was proud to have tabled Bill 51, the Citizen Initiative Act, before the floor of our great legislature. As the Premier said, Bill 51 provides a clear process. Every eligible Albertan voter may use to have their government consider their proposal for a new law, a new policy, or a constitutional referendum question. Here's how the process is designed to work. An Albertan with an initiative, big or small, that they would like to bring forward would first apply to the Chief Electoral Officer to start a petition for their idea. After submitting the application, the Chief Electoral Officer would provide them with the petition they need to gather signatures of eligible voters. For their petition to be successful, they would need to gather signatures from 10% of voters province-wide for legislative or policy initiatives. For constitutional initiatives, the threshold is higher. Petitioners would need the signatures of 20% of voters province-wide, as well as 20% of voters in each of 2/3 of Alberta's constituencies. In other words, in today's world of 87 constituencies, there would need to be 20% support in 58 constituencies. And that is 20% in each of those constituencies. They would have 90 days to gather the signatures. Once complete, the Chief Electoral Officer would review the signatures and determine if the requirements have been met. If they have, the legislative and policy initiatives in the petition would be referred to a committee of the Legislative Assembly for consideration. Successful constitutional initiatives would proceed through the process established in the Referendum Act. This includes a resolution being made in the Legislative Assembly and the Lieutenant Governor issuing an order for a referendum to be held. The Citizen Initiative Act would give Albertans an on-ramp to the legislative process. It would allow anyone with a fresh, worthy ideas access to government, giving them real and meaningful influence over how our province is run. Frankly, Albertans deserve a greater say in the democratic system than what they have traditionally been allowed. Albertans deserve to have a greater say in the issues that affect them. Through this legislation, we are strengthening the democratic system and giving Albertans an even more powerful voice in the governance of their province. After all, we govern at the instance of our people. The Citizen Initiative Act delivered substantial democratic reform for Alberta's voters. Thank you, and thank you, Premier, for leadership on this file. With that, we're able to take questions.
All right, we will go to the phones for questions from the media. We will do one question, one follow-up today. Operator, can you please put through the first question?
Thank you. Yes, the first question is from Rick Bell, Calgary Sun.
Good afternoon, Premier and Minister Madu. I have a question, and then I will have a supplementary. Premier, are you at all concerned that probably one of the most, I guess, possible referendum that could come out of this is a referendum on Alberta independence? So are you concerned that your legislation may open the door to a referendum on Alberta independence? And if there were to be such a referendum, would you be campaigning, obviously, for the no side?
Thank you, Rick. So it's up to Albertans to decide. This empowers them. That's the whole point of this. If there is a very significant public will to debate and decide on an important matter, it empowers ordinary Albertans to put that on the agenda. And so that's the whole point of the legislation. I'm not going to speculate on what Albertans might want to put on there. I will say that in the one time in recent Canadian history, an initiative law has successfully triggered a referendum vote was 11 years ago in BC when 700,000 British Columbians signed a petition to force a vote to stop the harmonization of the PST, provincial sales tax, with the GST. And so it shows that these things are workable, and that was with a higher threshold. And I can tell you this much: if I had been leader of the opposition when I was leader of the opposition 2 years ago, let me put it this way: if we had had a initiative law back then, I certainly would have used it to try to get signatures to force a referendum vote on the NDP's carbon tax. So those are the kinds of things I think we can expect, but it's up to people, it's up to Albertans to decide. Now, if they were proposing dramatic change to the Constitution, that would require 20% threshold here, and I should also add that the Chief Electoral Officer is given the authority under this bill to do a signal check, if you will, with the courts to see if a matter is constitutional, a regular legislative or policy matter. But Rick, my position on Alberta's role in the Canadian Federation is well known. I believe we need a strong Alberta that can defend our powers, our jurisdiction, our economic interests, our jobs, and our way of life. But I don't believe it would be, I think it would be a dead end for us to get into an endless debate over separating. We saw that happen in Quebec. We saw the consequences of it. I respect Albertans who have a different view from me on that, but it's no secret that I've always stood for a strong Alberta within a united Canada. And I would, that would always be my position.
And just a supplementary, could you explain, you said there's something about the chief, would an independence referendum in your mind be allowed, or would it be disallowed? You were talking a little bit about the chief electoral officer may have some say in the matter. And what do you think the traction would be, just from your feel of going out and about in Alberta? What do you think would be the appetite for such a referendum, particularly since if they need 20%, that could be, 500,000 signatures. Do you think there's really 500,000 signatures out there for Alberta independence? And would that kind of referendum be allowed? in this current law?
Well, if it took the form of a proposed constitutional amendment, it would, I believe, it would be permitted by the Chief Electoral Officer under this legislation, precisely because it would be a proposed constitutional amendment. So on your second question, Rick, look, what I hear from Albertans is an incredible frustration with the policies of Justin Trudeau and how his government has hammered this province and treated us unfairly on so many accounts. And I know there's also a deeper and long-lasting frustration with some ways that the whole country has operated to Alberta's disadvantage. And I know that there is a small minority of Albertans whose response to all of that unfairness is to talk about separation. But I do not believe that they are anywhere close to a majority of Albertans. The polling that I've seen suggests it's a small minority, and what I hear from people is they want us to fight to fix the problems in the country. They want fairness. They don't want Alberta to continue having to write a blank check to the rest of the country. They want equalization reform. They want pipelines. They want jobs. They want respect. But I think the vast majority of Albertans understand that separation is a dead end which would damage our economy. And so that's my read. That's what I hear from Albertans. And I'll just point out to you, in the last election, we had two separatist parties on the provincial ballot, and I think between them they got 1.5% of the vote. So that tells me that it's a pretty small minority. Again, they have a right to speak their minds, absolutely, and I respect that. But I'm always going to fight for a stronger Alberta within the Federation, which was the dream of the people who built this place.
Operator, can you please put through our next caller?
Thank you. Lisa Johnson, Edmonton Journal.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. This is for the Premier or the Minister, whoever wants to take it. I'm wondering if you can clarify, we didn't get full clarity this morning during the technical briefing, just comparing this proposed bill to the similar law that already exists in British Columbia. In British Columbia, after a successful initiative vote, the government would be forced to introduce a bill in the legislature at the earliest opportunity. Of course, once the bill is introduced, there's no guarantee it would be passed. Would Alberta's law be similarly binding? That is, if a successful initiative vote was done, would the legislature have to introduce a bill?
Well, my understanding, and Kaycee, please correct me, because I know this has gone through a number of different versions, is that the legislature could choose. Let's say there was an ordinary policy or legislative initiative that got the requisite signatures and had been certified by the Chief Electoral Officer as being constitutionally compliant, et cetera. Then the legislature, the governor, lieutenant governor and council could choose to introduce that as a bill and just pass it through the ledge, which would avoid the expense and cost and hassle of a referendum vote. Or if it was a matter of particular contention and people really wanted to have a direct say, it could go to a referendum. Is that correct?
Yes, Premier. So with respect to policy and legislative methods, there will be a reference to the Legislative Assembly, and with respect to constitutional matters, that would go to the Cabinet through the referendum process as laid out in the Referendum Act. And so that is how this is designed in this particular bill.
And Lisa, if I could just point out one thing, this question of whether it's binding on the legislature is a bit of a tricky constitutional issue, because the sort of constitutional principle in our Westminster parliamentary democracy is that the legislature cannot be bound. But that may be true in a kind of legal, strictly de jure sense, but in a de facto political sense, I think the legislature would be bound to give effect to a positive initiative vote. Certainly in the case of BC back in 2010, when they got the 700,000 signatures to force a vote on the harmonization of the PSD, as you'll know, what the legislature did was they said, okay, we get the message, and they organized a government referendum. So I think what it does is it creates political facts, and both the government and the legislature simply have to respond to those.
And do you have a follow-up, Lisa?
No, thank you. I'll cede my time to somebody else.
Thanks. Operator, can you please put through our next caller?
Thank you. Janet French, CBC.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. Either the Premier or the Minister would be great, depending on who has the best expertise here. So kind of following up on Lisa's question, it sounds like from the technical information we received, the Cabinet still has the discretion on prompting a provincial plebiscite for a legislative issue or a policy referendum, and whether or not the results of that vote would be binding. So I guess I'm just curious if the Cabinet still has some say here, how that leaves power in the hands of the people.
Thank you, Janet. So to be clear, the Lieutenant Governor, if a matter is to proceed to a referendum, the Lieutenant Governor would have to issue that particular order for that matter to proceed to a referendum. For the Lieutenant Governor to do so, it has to be done through an order in council, and that goes through Cabinet with respect to largely constitutional matters. What is being proposed with respect to legislative and the policy matters is that once the Chief Electoral Officer confirms that the threshold has been met, the Chief Electoral Officer would then refer the matter to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. And then that assembly would then make a determination as to whether or not to proceed. Once that is decided, obviously it is the government represented by Cabinet that then begin to put the process in motion for that to take place. So that is the process that we have laid out in the Citizens Initiative Act.
And there is a distinction here as well, Janet, as you understand, in our Westminster parliamentary system, to spend money requires what's called a royal recommendation. So that has to come from the Lieutenant Governor. It's a constitutional requirement. So if voters, 10% are certified as having signed a valid policy proposal or legislative proposal, which would require additional spending, then there would have to be a royal recommendation to the Legislative Assembly. So this is, I guess these are ways that we have to work through, marrying the traditions of the Westminster system with this more kind of direct democracy. But at the end of the day, like, let me be clear, if you look at page 18 and 19 of the bill, section 15, and I'll just kind of summarize this in plain English. It basically says that if the Chief Electoral Officer certifies that a policy or legislative proposal has achieved the requisite number of signatures validly, then it is the Speaker then lays that proposal before the legislature, and a committee it receives the proposal. They get 90 days to study it, and they can then recommend whether or not to proceed with it as through the ledge, which would remove the need for a referendum vote. But so basically, that's a fast-track way of getting it done. If the proponents want it done quickly, the ledge says, "Okay, folks, we hear you. You signed a petition. We will do this through the ledge quickly." But the ledge could say, you know what, we really don't like this idea. We're going to oppose this idea, and we're going to put it to a referendum vote, and we'll have it out as a big democratic debate. So the ledge gets to decide which way to go, whether the actual proposal gets passed through the ledge or whether it goes direct to the voters in a referendum. But either way, it either gets passed through the ledge or the voters get their final say. I hope that's clear.
And Janet, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, unrelated. So, I mean, obviously you've already said that equalization will go to a referendum in Alberta. So I'm curious, what issue prompted you to want to give citizens the ability to prompt a referendum on a constitutional matter?
Well, it seems to me just democratic. One of the questions that we put to the Fair Deal panel back in the November of 2019 was, for example, whether Alberta as a province should have its own constitution. that would be kind of a formal. There have been academics who proposed this idea where we would take, the Alberta Act and other relevant statutes and bring them together and formalize it as a provincial constitution, much like the province of Quebec has its own Charter of Rights. So those would be the sorts of things which Albertans would be able to speak to directly through the initiative process. As I say, I suspect, most of the time when we've seen initiatives take off in various parts of the democratic world, it's very often dealt with things like taxation and pocketbook issues. That's, if you go back and look at the passage of the BC initiative law in the early mid-90s, they built in very high thresholds, much higher than these. And I think they were surprised, though, in 2010 to see over 700,000 British Columbians sign a petition on harmonization of the GST. So all I can tell you is I know if we had an initiative law 3-4 years ago, I would have worked on an initiative to repeal the carbon tax. I suspect people in the agricultural community would have worked on an initiative to repeal Bill 6. Those are the kinds of things where you see a lot of energy when people's pocketbooks and their life is being directly affected by government policies, which I think typically inspires the energy behind a successful initiative.
Okay, we have time for 2 more callers. Operator, can you please put through the next question?
Thank you. Graham Thompson, iPolitics.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. Mr. Premier, just wondering, one issue that hasn't been brought up today was, the Bigfoot family issue. And you were asked about it today in question period. And the War Room or the Energy Center, is this the kind of thing you wanted the War Room to be fighting on? It's a kid's cartoon. What do you think of the actual, this whole fight against Netflix?
So, Graham, what I promised Albertans was that we would set up we would fight for Alberta and our largest industry, and we would respond in real time to all of the lies and myths being said about our oil and gas industry and its responsible resource development. So you can dismiss this as, quotes, merely a kids show, but it's clear that they developed content designed to defame in the most vicious way possible, in the impressionable minds of kids, the largest industry in the province. And so we can just pretend that's not a reality. Just ignore it. Just say that big Hollywood operations should be able to depict the oil and gas industry as, in the words of Netflix, quotes, evil, that oil and gas companies plot to murder people and are organized purposefully to destroy the environment. That is the depiction made in this kids show. And I think we have every, Albertans and people who defend our oil and gas workers have every right to set the record straight, to put a spotlight on those kinds of outrageous lies and that kind of defamation, whether it is an entertainment show targeting kids or it's a hard news show targeting grown-ups. If they are lying, and particularly with this kind of vicious sort of defamation, accusing oil companies not just of their not raising the environmental implications of hydrocarbons, but accusing oil companies of basically being the mafia of conspiring to murder people, including kids. I think that's pretty darn serious. And I see here that in the Sun newspaper in the United Kingdom, which is one of the most widely read newspapers in the world, the Canadian Energy Centre managed to register the point. Headline, put their foot in it. Netflix's The Bigfoot Family blasted for brainwashing kids with lies with divisive bombing storyline. That is in front of millions of readers in Europe right now. And it has flagged for them this effort to mislead kids and accuse the oil industry of being a bunch of murderers. So yeah, this is exactly the sort of thing. I mean, the Canadian Energy Centre is doing a lot of other work, as you will know. This one issue may lend itself to sensationalism by some, but you can go to their website and see the lengthy and thoughtful footnoted papers and original research they have done on a range of issues related to, for example, the environment, economic opportunity, government revenues generated by oil and gas, by Indigenous economic involvement, and so forth. So it's a broader course of a broader project than simply responding to things like this. But I do think things like this need to be responded to.
And just to follow up on that, sir, I think you're defending the Energy Centre. The budget was to be $30 million a year. That apparently has dropped down to $12 million, and I was told by somebody in the government it might even drop down to $10 million. So are you reducing the budget for the the Energy Centre, and if so, why?
So to be clear, what we committed to in the election was that we would dedicate $30 million budget to advocacy to defend our largest industry and all of the jobs that depend on it. That $10 million of that would be reprofiled from the Government of Alberta advertising budget through communications and public engagement, which had in the past supported pro-oil and gas advertising. Secondly, that $10 million of it would be funded by the Technology, Innovation and Emissions Reduction Fund. And so the $30 million budget for pro-energy advocacy resides in the Department of Energy. It's a line item in their estimates, and they decide how to spend that. Some of it goes to support the Canadian energy industry. Some of it will go to support the new ESG Secretariat in my Department of Executive Council, and it supports other pro-energy advocacy. At the beginning of the pandemic a year ago, we did make a decision not to spend about 90% of the Department of Energy's $30 million advocacy budget because everything was about COVID a year ago. And so we suspended the planned advertising campaigns. But I think as we begin emerging from COVID, both the Canadian Energy Centre and other branches, other organizations within the broader Government of Alberta structure will restart pro-energy advertising campaigns. You know, you'll recall the previous government, for example, spent advertising dollars on informing British Columbians about the importance of the Trans Mountain expansion. You might see us restart a campaign in that respect. Perhaps we'll invest in public awareness in Michigan with respect to Line 5 and similar projects of that nature.
Operator, can you please put through our last caller?
Thank you. The final question is from Cian Bexte, Rebel News.
Hi, Premier. Thank you for taking my question again. I'd like to follow up on what my friend Rick Bell asked, and you said that it was a small minority of Albertans that supports separation, and the most recent poll that I've seen at least puts it at about 25%, and other polls have been even higher than that. I wouldn't call 1 million people a small minority by any means. So it's certainly plausible that a referendum could come up with, should this law pass and should it come up. Would you remain neutral in that referendum campaign like you said you would with any sort of recall?
So, Cian, what I said about recall is that it's really between the constituents and their MLA, and I don't think a party leader should get involved in that. But certainly I would anticipate taking a position on referendum issues. Perhaps there might be some I'm neutral about. I'm not neutral about many issues, though. And I'm certainly not neutral, and nor am I do I ever run from the fact that I believe in a strong Alberta within a united Canada. That is, I believe, the position of the vast majority of Albertans. I agree that there is a minority that disagrees with that position. They have every right to speak their minds. And at the end of the day, I would absolutely defend the future of this province within the Canadian Economic Union, and fight for it, fight for fairness, fight for equalization reform, fight for a fair deal. But I'm not going to be neutral on an issue which I think would fundamentally undermine our economic future, like it did for Quebec for so long.
Sure, and just to follow up is, the Albertans that I've talked to at least sort of, I think they look at separation sort of as a last case, worst case scenario, and they're looking to you for some sort of hammer, like some sort of or else, right? Like Justin Trudeau can use seems to be ahead of Alberta at every turn. What do you say are Alberta's bartering chips outside of separation?
Very good question, and that's why we've always planned to have the equalization referendum later in our term, in October of this year. Some people have been angry that we didn't pull the trigger on that right away, and my point was we've needed to maintain some leverage to fight for a fair deal in the country, and that vote on the presence of the principle of equalization in the Canadian Constitution, in my view, will elevate our fight for fairness to the top of the national agenda. And it's out there, believe me. Ottawa doesn't like that idea, and a number of other provinces don't either. They've spoken to me about this, but I make no apologies for our plan to hold that vote, to do it in October. We need to see, for example, tangible progress. I know that for Albertans who are frustrated with this Trudeau government and the way the Federation works, I share their frustration. But at the end of the day, what matters most for the vast majority of Albertans is jobs in the economy, getting pipelines built, having a future for our energy industry. And that's why, for example, we need the federal government to ensure continued construction on the Trans Mountain expansion. And I would also say we don't get much credit for this as government, but we have won some fights, important fights for jobs in Alberta in dealing with Ottawa. If we had not gotten the equivalency agreement on the major emitter levy tier, the feds would have bigfooted in here with their approach that would have added billions of dollars of additional cost to our trade-exposed energy industry. Same with the methane regulations. Same with the caribou habitat protection regulations that we've got under the Species at Risk Act. So those are important wins, and we've got to just keep our eye on the ball. The equalization referendum will happen this October. And this Citizens Initiative Act gives Albertans additional tools to raise issues that matter most to them.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks
folks.
everyone.
Thank you so much.